Welcome everybody to another one of our Zoom evenings that we are doing instead of meeting in person. And looking forward to this one. It sounds like a very interesting one. And again, I just hope everybody is keeping well and getting a chance to go out and enjoy some nature and see some birds in a safe manner. And of course, the backyard birding as well, as we were just talking about. So I'd like to welcome Kat Lucas, and I'm going to let Ken introduce Kat for tonight's talk. And after the presentation, we're going to have a short tribute to Carolynn Fishleigh. So I hope you'll all stay around for that one. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure I know how to get myself highlighted here again, but you can all hear me anyways, right? Our Great Lakes support a diverse array of plants and animals with rich ecosystems that are unique in the world. The lakes provide us with fresh drinking water, food, and recreational opportunities.
This session will focus. Our internet is very bad here tonight, and you're coming in very, just every once in a while we get a word, but we might not end up staying as the signal seems to be very bad.
Okay, well, I'll try to speak up. This session will focus on some of the species at risk in our Great Lakes and our role as individuals to protect this sensitive ecosystem. Kat Lucas, our speaker, is the Aqualinks Program Assistant at the Toronto Zoo. She has a passion for conservation education and connecting others with the environment. She graduated from the University of Guelph with a Bachelor of Science, Zoology, and a Master's of Environmental Science with a focus on aquatic toxicology and fish reproduction. And just before I turn it over to Kat, I'll just remind people that usually on the bottom of the screen, there's a little dialogue picture that says chat. And that's where during your presentation, you can pop any questions in there for Kat. And at the end of the presentation, we'll deal with those questions. So over to Kat.
All right, thank you for having me tonight. I am going to share some slides, and when I'm sharing the slides, I might not be able to keep an eye on the chat box, but feel free to put them in. I will be starting with some slides and then head into some models to switch things up and make it a little more fun, and then we'll head back to the slides at the end, and there will be some more time for questions at the end and throughout the presentation. And I will get started. All right. So Ken did a little intro, and I can provide a little bit more as well. I have my Bachelor's of Science in Zoology as well as a Master's of Environmental Science, both from the University of Guelph. And for my Master's, I focused on aquatic toxicology, where I was studying the effects of pharmaceuticals on fish reproduction. I was specifically looking at how Tylenol would be affecting fish, which is a kind of drug that many of us have taken throughout our lives, and seeing whether or not that would have any impact on fish reproduction. And the good news is that even at very high concentrations of Tylenol, the fish in my study group were A-okay. So if you need to take Tylenol, you can continue to do so without a guilty conscience. I've got certificates in environmental conservation and leadership. And back in May, I was feeling like I had a lot of extra time on my hands. So I started a certificate of community development and engagement to learn more about engaging with different communities. I am bilingual, so I can do these presentations in English and French, and we do these presentations for school groups as well. So if you know any educators or teachers in your life who are looking to switch things up in the virtual classroom these days, you can give me an email right down there, and we'd be happy to hook you up with a free presentation all about the Great Lakes and the different species at risk here. And before I get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement and acknowledge that the land that the Toronto Zoo is on is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Anishinaabe, the the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and many bands of Chippewa, including the Chippewa of Georgina Island. So we would like to acknowledge that our First Nations peoples were long the stewards and caretakers of this land. And hopefully during the presentation today, we might feel a little more inspired, learn something new, and of course, continue to be stewards for this land. Here we've got a map of the Great Lakes. That stars you tonight up in Midland and Penetanguishene, and I am down in Toronto these days. And the Great Lake that is the closest to you would of course be Lake Huron. And Lake Huron does have the longest coastline of any of our Great Lakes. That's because of all of those islands in there, as well as the added benefit of having Georgian Bay in there. Lake Erie would be the smallest of the Great Lakes. Then we have Lake Michigan, which is the only Great Lake that's entirely in the United States of America. And it is also the Great Lake with the highest human population on its shores. And then up top, we have Lake Superior, which is the largest of our Great Lakes, and it holds about 50% of all of the water in our Great Lakes. That's how big it is. We do share the Great Lakes between our two countries, so it's important for all of us on both sides, including our governments, to do what we can to protect the Great Lakes, as they provide water to about 25% of all Canadians. So it's a pretty good reason for us to protect the Great Lakes for us humans, but the Great Lakes are also home to about 3,500 species. So that's another really good reason to keep them safe. We also have so many different kinds of habitats here in our Great Lakes, everything from these nice sandy beaches with the big open water. And of course, open water provides great habitat to many larger species of fish. We also have lots of rivers, whether they're big or small. And generally in our rivers, the water is moving a bit faster, and that's better habitat for animals who prefer that faster moving water. On the other hand, though, we do have wetlands where the water is very still. It almost doesn't move at all. And that provides a nice habitat for some of our living things who prefer that lazier lifestyle. And then we even have lots of these rocky areas up near Tobermory, as well as near you on Lake Huron, that offer all of these caves and hidey holes for different species as well. Because we have so many different kinds of habitats here in our Great Lakes, we're able to support so many different kinds of life. So like I said, about 3,500 species live in and around the Great Lakes. So that's a lot of biodiversity that we have here. We have everything from insects, and some insects like dragonflies or mosquitoes start their life in water and then grow their wings and leave as adults. Of course, we have fishes in our Great Lakes, and we will be talking about a handful of these locally endangered fish today. Crayfishes, reptiles like our turtles, plants, fungi, mussels, which are just another word for clams. And mussels often are overlooked. They often look like rocks and are pretty boring to look at and think about. But hopefully today we'll learn a little bit more about mussels, and we'll be a little more inspired to learn more and look for them next time we're out in nature. We've got mammals like our beavers, birds, and amphibians like our frogs and toads. So many different kinds of life here. But tonight we'll be focusing on fish and mussels. In our Great Lakes, we have over 150 different kinds of fish, everything from small minnows like our red-side dace, up to the largest freshwater fish that we find here in our Great Lakes, which would be the lake sturgeon, and they can grow to be about 2 meters long. Of these 150 kinds of fish, about 20% of them are listed as at risk. So they are endangered, threatened, special concern. They are something that needs a little bit more attention from us humans to get them back on the right track and stabilize those populations. For our freshwater mussels, we have about 40 species here in Ontario. Canada as a whole has about 50 freshwater mussel species. So Ontario is Canada's freshwater mussel hotspot. As I said earlier, we often don't think of them very much. They are not exciting creatures. They're not doing fun things or looking all that cute, but they are so important for our ecosystems. They are like nature's water treatment plant because they are filter feeders, and they will actually clean the water as they eat. and they are eating things like bacteria like E. coli, as well as algae. And those are things, of course, that us humans don't want in the water, whether we're drinking it or swimming in it. And so these mussels are doing us that ecosystem service. About 65% of our freshwater mussels in Canada are listed as at risk. So again, their populations are starting to decline. We don't know that much about them to begin with, so we need to spend a little bit more time and a little more care learning more about them so we can better protect them. And I will talk a little bit about some of the ways we can do that during the presentation tonight. Well, let's get started and check out some of these animals that we have here in our Great Lakes. To start, this is a lake sturgeon, and as I said before, they are the largest freshwater fish that we will find here in our Great Lakes, growing about 2 meters long, sometimes getting close to 300 pounds. They are prehistoric fish, which means the family of lake sturgeon existed before and during dinosaurs. Of course, our dinosaurs didn't make it, but the lake sturgeon family has continued down till today. The way that we know just how old lake sturgeon are, or their family is based on what their skeleton is made of, and it is not made of bone. You might have an idea in your head about what it could be made of instead. It's the same thing that our ears and our noses are made of, which is cartilage. So that's a little bit softer than bone, and that's what most of their skeleton is made of. You might know of another fish who is also made of cartilage, and that would be sharks. So they're in a very similar family. We know that cartilage evolved before bone, so that's why we know the family of sharks and family of sturgeons have been around since before dinosaurs. You might be looking at this shark and see that mouthful of teeth and be a little bit worried about swimming with these lake sturgeon in our Great Lakes. And the good news is that lake sturgeon don't have any teeth. So we don't need to worry about them nibbling on our toes because they instead have these barbels on their chin, those whiskers that are covered in taste buds. And they will use those barbels and sift through the sand and the gravel at the bottom of these lakes. When they taste bugs, they will just slurp them up whole. So they are not something that is going to get us while we're out swimming, even though they look pretty big. There are two main reasons that lake sturgeon are endangered, and they're having a pretty tough go because only within the past few months they've moved from threatened to endangered, which is one step closer to extinct. And that is not the direction that we would like to see them go. The first reason is that they live a very long time. They can live over 100 years. And because they live so long, everything in their life happens a little bit slower. So they don't reach sexual maturity until about 30 or 35 years old. And that's a very long time as a wild animal to stay alive, avoid being eaten by another fish while they're still small, or avoid being interfered with by any sort of human activity. And that's 35 years before they can even have their first round of eggs and have those first round of babies. So that's a pretty tough life. When we put it into perspective, humans often live to be around 100 years old. However, we reach sexual maturity around 15. So it's taking twice as long for this lake sturgeon for its body to be ready to reproduce compared to us humans. Another reason that lake sturgeon are endangered is because of something that some fancy people like to eat. And that fancy thing would be caviar, which is just the fancy word for fish eggs. Back in the day, lake sturgeon caviar used to be quite a delicacy and had pretty high value. And for a while, it was being over-harvested. Luckily, though, about 50 years ago, the government put a ban on harvesting or collecting lake sturgeon caviar, so it is now illegal to do so. However, even in the past 50 years with these new rules, it still hasn't been enough to help those lake sturgeon recover because, again, it's taking them so long to reproduce. And the lake sturgeon are in Lake Huron. They used to be through more of the Great Lakes, but their population is starting to just move a little bit farther north and really get mostly isolated in Lake Superior with a few other little spots through our Great Lakes. Next up, we have the red-side dace, and unfortunately, I don't have a 2-meter long model of a lake sturgeon at home, but I do have models of the rest of the fish that I'm going to talk about tonight. So I will stop screen sharing now. You might, I think, Ken put me on Spotlight, so I should be nice and big, but if I'm not, you can just switch me to speaker view, and then that should make me nice and big. But to get started, we've got this little fish here who is called a red-side dace. And you can see it's got red on its side, and dace is just another word for a small fish. Even as a full-size adult, they are only about as long as my finger, so not very big at all. They're in the same family as minnows. These little fish would be found in Lake Huron. Most of their population, about 80% of them, do live within the Lake Ontario watershed, primarily within the Greater Toronto Area. But there are select populations in Lake Huron as well as in Lake Erie. But this little fish is a carnivore, and of course that means they eat only meat, and their preferred snack are things like mosquitoes and flies. And as naturalists, I'm sure you can appreciate something that's out there eating mosquitoes for us, so that there's few less mosquito bites we might see in the summer. But to catch these mosquitoes, they will actually jump into the air and grab them as the mosquitoes are flying. And they can jump about 10 centimeters out of the water. So that's pretty impressive. They are the only minnow in Canada who eats this way. As I mentioned, though, they are endangered. So they are also seeing a decline in their populations. And that has a lot to do with where most of them are living, which is in our big cities. And they were here before our cities were big cities. And unfortunately, that is just their natural range. And they are now trying really hard to put up with everything that comes with living in a big city. So they are experiencing pollution and litter and just lowered water quality in general. And that's giving them a pretty hard time here. And that is because they rely so heavily on their vision to catch their prey. They will go and sit at the surface of the water and look up, and when they see those mosquitoes, they'll jump. However, if the water has lots of pollutants or chemicals or litter in it, they can't see as well through that water, and it's harder for them to catch their prey and to hunt. So that's why we are seeing a pretty big decline in their populations, at least in the Greater Toronto Area. The ones out near Lake Huron are probably faring a little bit better, not as many humans to keep up with up there. Again, I'll just remind you, you can post in the chat box throughout if you've got any questions, and I'll take them, or I'll try to take them as we go. And of course, we'll have time at the end as well. The next fish that I'm going to introduce tonight is an American eel. This again is a full-sized model, so this one's about 1 meter long. And American eels, they do live here in Lake Ontario, so they never were quite as far north as Lake Huron, but they are another fish that we have in our Great Lakes that's endangered. And American eels do one of the longest migrations of any fish species. All American eels, whether they live in North America or on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in Europe or even Africa, will all travel down to basically just off the coast of Florida in an area called the Sargasso Sea in the Atlantic Ocean. And that's where they'll all gather to breed. Once they get there, they spawn and then they die because they've just spent all of this energy traveling back to this breeding site, and all they have left is to breed, and that's the extent of the energy that they've got saved up. Once they breed, these new little babies will start to hatch, and they will start swimming up the coast of North America in this case, or they might swim all the way to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean on the west or the east side of the Atlantic Ocean. But these little eels, when they're small, they are so vulnerable to predators like larger fish who want to eat them. So they are luckily prepared to be out in the world on their own. And they are, when they hatch, they are entirely transparent and see-through. And that's really great camouflage. As they're traveling, it's harder for these other fish to find them and to try and eat them. This is really great because many fish, or most fish really, don't do any sort of parental care. As we heard, these eels are dying as soon as they lay their eggs, so they're not around to try and protect these babies. Once the eels get up the coast of North America, they'll start turning into our freshwater rivers, and that's where they'll spend the next big chunk of their life. In these rivers, they'll start eating much more food, and they'll start to pick up some of the pigment of the food that they're eating. So to start, they're eating mostly aquatic invertebrates and aquatic insects, and they are starting to pick up a little bit of yellow. So they'll start turning from transparent to yellow. And then again, as they continue to grow, they'll start eating more fish. And once they start eating some fish into their diet, they'll start to turn more silver. And then finally, as full-sized adults, they will end up being much darker green or brown. And that's just because their diet has switched basically to entirely fish. After about 5 years or so in these freshwater rivers, they turn right back around and swim down to Florida to spawn and die. This migration can reach about 5,000 kilometers round trip. So that's, to put into perspective, that's like us getting in a car and driving all the way to the Yukon and back. That's about 500 hours of driving. And you can imagine just how long this is taking for a little eel. And sometimes on their way back down to Florida, it can take about 2 years of travel time, though it's also been seen that it takes less than a few months too. So sometimes they're very speedy, 2 months, and sometimes it's 2 years, just depending on where they are in the world. Our eels, though, they are another species that are endangered here in our Great Lakes, and that has to do with barriers to their migration. Back in the day, when we started developing the area, we would have started building things like pulp mills and lumber mills, which would have been blocking the rivers. From there, though, as we continued to develop, we built hydroelectric dams, which are much, much bigger and are just huge barriers in their migration. And eels are now having some difficulty navigating around these dams and getting where they need to go to either eat or to spawn. However, one very cool thing about American eels is that they can breathe in water like a fish, of course, with gills, but they can also breathe on land. And when they come up onto land, they can move sort of like a snake, and then they produce lots of mucus all over their skin. And once they're nice and slimy, they can actually breathe through their skin. So they can often use this technique to hop out of the water and get around some of these smaller dams. However, with a larger dam, it can be a much bigger challenge for them. However, us humans, we've noticed our mistakes as well, and we've started to build things to help our eels as well as our salmon and trout who migrate to get around these dams. So sometimes we see something called a fishway, which is like a water slide that runs beside the dam or underneath the dam, and that the fish can take that and get around. Sometimes we see something called a fish ladder, which are like steps that the fish can jump up and over. And then sometimes even we see something called a salmon cannon, which is like a big tube, and the fish can swim into the tube and basically be launched up and over safely to get to the other side of these dams. So their populations definitely have dropped, but we have figured out some ways to help them bypass some of these barriers. The next fish I'm going to talk about is the Atlantic salmon. So again, we've got this full-size model here, just about 3 feet long. And Atlantic salmon are another one that we have down in Lake Ontario, not quite as far north as Lake Huron, but they are a kind of fish that is locally extinct here in our Great Lakes. And the big word for that is extirpated. So it's one step above endangered in the way that there actually isn't a self-sustaining population in Lake Ontario. However, of course, many of us eat Atlantic salmon, so we know that they're still around somewhere. And there's lots of Atlantic salmon still in the Atlantic Ocean, anywhere from Lake Newfoundland to Norway. However, the population that used to exist in Lake Ontario, a very special population that was landlocked because it didn't go out to the ocean, no longer exists. And unfortunately, about 200 years ago, when our first settlers came in, they overfished the Atlantic salmon in Lake Ontario down to nothing. So unfortunately, they're not really here anymore. The Toronto Zoo, though, is part of the conservation efforts there, where we are trying to bring back the Atlantic salmon into Lake Ontario. And we have a program where we help students raise Atlantic salmon in classrooms, and they usually get the eggs in January and then raise them until the spring around May and June. And then we go and release them out into local waterways around the city. In a good year, we're releasing about 3,000 Atlantic salmon, little fry. This year, we're probably not going to do that, just with so much uncertainty with the schools. And last year was pretty uncertain as well. But we are also so lucky that we work with partners with the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, as well as the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. And with our partners, usually we're releasing about tens of thousands of these Atlantic salmon fry into Lake Ontario every year. So our partners will still keep going full steam ahead, even without our education portion this year. And this program has been running for about 12 years now. And the good news is that we're starting to see these adults returning to these local rivers and starting to spawn. So that population is starting to take on its own sustaining. So it's some good news there. I did see one question that I'll get to, and I'll chat a little bit more about the salmon. Is there an evolutionary link between eels and snakes? And I think the easy answer there is no. Fish would have evolved long before the eels. Sorry, fish would have evolved long before snakes. So at one point, fish started leaving the water, and that's where I believe we started getting more reptiles. So then that's when we would have seen that, but the fish would have been there before. They would have evolved independently into that same shape. Next up, I guess continuing with our Atlantic salmon, we'll look at their life cycle. And they will start their life as an egg. We've got some fake salmon eggs here. They're about the size of a green pea, and they're usually bright red or orange in color. From here, they will hatch into what we call an alvin, and the alvin is about 1 centimeter long, basically the size of your thumbnail. And at this point, like those baby eels that are see-through, our baby Atlantic salmon are very vulnerable to predators. So they need some way to help them out as they hatch, with their parents aren't around to help them. So in this case, they hatch with something called a yolk sac. And that's like a big orange blob on their body filled with nutrients, basically like a built-in fridge. And so they're able to now hide and avoid being eaten and just eat with all of this nutrients that they have stored. Once they fully absorb that, we call them a fry. And at this point, they're bigger, they're stronger, they're a little more agile, and they can start catching their own food while avoiding other predators. From the fry, they will keep growing as they have so many more opportunities to eat, until about a few years later, they will turn into what we call a smolt. And this is about 8 inches long or so. And at this point, they are like the teenagers of the salmon world. And they say, I'm done living at home. I'm off to see the world. And they'll start their migration. So they will start swimming from these freshwater rivers. If we're talking about our landlocked population in Lake Ontario, they would just go straight to Lake Ontario and hang out there. But of course, our salmon who live closer to the coast will go all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean. These big bodies of water, they're like an all-you-can-eat buffet. There's so much food out there. So they will grow from about this size to full size in another maybe 3 to 5 years. Once they're full size, they will then turn back around and head back to the streams where they hatched themselves to then spawn again and continue the life cycle. One cool thing about our Atlantic salmon who were in Lake Ontario is that their migration was much shorter. So it might only be about 20 kilometers from that freshwater stream where they hatched into Lake Ontario. So they have more energy to spawn for multiple years. Whereas our salmon on the coast, whether it's Pacific or Atlantic, their migration would be much longer. And again, it takes so much energy to return to those freshwater rivers that they just have enough to spawn and then die. So one other little benefit of living their lives in the Great Lakes. I saw something in the chat. What are the salmon that we see in the Rouge River? Well, there are many different kinds of salmon that we might see there, and many kinds of trout look a lot like salmon too, but they could be possibly Atlantic salmon. We do release some salmon out in Duffins Creek, which is in Ajax, and it's possible that they would have gotten a little closer to the Rouge River there too in Scarborough. However, they could also be pink salmon. They could also be a couple other different kinds of Pacific salmon, because Pacific salmon are stocked in our Great Lakes. So it's possible it's one of those. Without knowing which time of year or really getting an up close look at them, it would be pretty hard to tell which is which just from a distance. Are there any other questions? Because I will head back to the slides, and I should still be able to check the chat as I go there. All right. So we will see a few pictures of the things that I talked about too. So that's our red-side dace. They're the ones that eat mosquitoes for us, and they are having a hard time because of low water quality from pollution and littering. Then we've got our American eels. We see right in the middle, that's that little glass eel, totally see-through, and such great camouflage when they're still young and can't really defend themselves otherwise. Then we've got our Atlantic salmon, that's that word extirpated, locally extinct. And we've got pictures on the right that show them at different life stages. So up top, those are those eggs, bright orange, about the size of a little green pea. And those black spots are their eyes, which they've already developed, even while still in the egg. Next up, we have the alvin, and you can see that yolk sac. It's kind of similar to the yellow part of a chicken egg, right, where all of the nutrients is, and that's how they get through that first 6 months of their life. And then below that, we have the fry, same size, little French fry, about 1 inch long or so. And that's when they start to pick up some patterning, and they're ready to go off into the world on their own. Next up, we have a spotted gar, and these are a very cool looking fish. We do have a model in the making right now that should be here in the next few months. So I'm looking forward to having one of those to add to our collection. But they've got a really long beak and lots of sharp teeth in that nose, in that mouth. And they are an ambush predator, which means that they will hide and wait. And once they see something that they want to eat, they will jump up and grab it. As we can see on the left, it's got its dinner in its mouth. And they are nocturnal, which helps again with this, with being an ambush predator. They're taking advantage of the shadows at night and able to hide very well and then jump out at their prey. They are endangered though, mainly due to habitat destruction. So we are seeing that they are losing plant cover that they would normally hide in. And as they lose plants, they're losing firstly a hiding spot. And secondly, plants are very good at keeping the sediments like the sand or the clay at the bottom of these lakes. However, without those plants, the water can become really murky and cloudy, and an ambush predator relies on their sight to catch their prey. So again, just like our red-side dace, if they can't see well through the water, it makes hunting quite difficult. I think I saw some in the chat here. Oh, it's not letting me see. Oops. Are their eyes at all functional during this stage, during the egg stage? It's hard to tell. We don't know. I don't know if scientists have really figured that out yet, how another animal really sees, especially during like this developmental stage. It would be hard to know whether they can see for sure. However, at this stage, they can sense light. So we often have to remind teachers and students when we bring them into the classroom to not shine lights on the salmon We do provide insulation to cover the aquarium to make sure that it stays dark and cold. And that is because if they get too much light as an egg before they're really finished developing, it can kill them. So it is, whether or not they can see, hard to know, but they can be affected by too much light. Is there more than one type of gar in Lake Huron? I've seen gar in the Wye River. I believe it would just be spotted gar up here, and we are just at the very top of the northern range. So really, we would unlikely see any other kinds. There is a Florida gar, but again, its range is just a little farther south than our Great Lakes. A full-size spotted gar is going to be about the same size as our salmon here, about 2 to 3 feet in length. And you can keep those questions coming. I'll just get back to the slides. All right, and then we'll switch it up a little bit and look at this freshwater mussel. This one here is a northern riffle shell. And as I said before, our freshwater mussels are filter feeders. So they are taking in water, they are pulling out algae and bacteria. They are eating those things and basically spitting out the water cleaner than it was to start. This little shell is only about 1 inch or 2 long, and that's on the smaller side of our freshwater mussels. Some of them can get basically as big as your hand. So for a small one that's filtering 9 liters of water an hour, we can just imagine how much more some of our bigger mussels are doing and keeping that water clean for us humans, as well as all of the other wildlife and living things out there. Mussels are also in the same family as snails, so they do have that hard exterior shell and a squishy living thing in there. And like I said, right, they look kind of like rocks. They're not all that exciting. And a lot of mussels won't move more than a few meters in their whole lifetime as adults. Once they grow their shell and they land, they do not do much moving. So it's hard to gain interest on these guys. However, they are also endangered, so we do want to worry about them. The northern riffle shell specifically might not be all the way through Lake Huron, but there are many different kinds of freshwater mussels that are through our Great Lakes. This is just one example. And all of them are suffering, though, because of the invasive zebra mussel. The zebra mussels are in our Great Lakes, and they are outcompeting our native freshwater mussels for food and for habitat space. And I will get into a little bit more about those zebra mussels in a little bit. Some of the threats that we see here are, of course, habitat destruction, and I've talked about some of these already, but we're seeing our cities keep growing and our agricultural fields keep growing, and they're just growing right into our green spaces and our natural spaces. And that's affecting pretty much all of our living things, especially our fish and our mussels when we have things like pesticides or fertilizers being applied too close to water, and those can have big impacts on our Great Lakes. With our cities, we're seeing more and more than ever that people want to live in the big city, which often leads to more pollution, more littering, more contaminants often entering our natural bodies of water. We've got overfishing on here, and overfishing isn't as big of a problem as it used to be, mostly because we have a lot more regulations and quotas put in for both personal and commercial fisheries in our Great Lakes. However, bycatch can still be a problem, especially with a fish as large as a lake sturgeon. They can very easily get caught in the nets and be pulled up by accident. We talked about those hydroelectric dams and how they create barriers to migration, but we also talked about some of those things that humans have come up with to help. And then lastly, we're seeing lots of littering as well as pollution in our Great Lakes, whether it's things like our single-use plastics that just aren't getting into the garbage and are finding their ways out into our environment, or things like runoff from our cities, especially at this time of year. We see lots of road salts entering these natural bodies of water. in the Greater Toronto Area, they've done studies where they found that some of our local waterways are as salty as the ocean after lots of snowfall, and that snow begins to melt and carry that the road salts right into our sewers and into our Great Lakes. And of course, our freshwater fish are not too happy about that. So something just to keep in mind at this time of year, especially about how much road salts we need to use and whether we can balance them out with some sand or another alternative. I did see 2 questions come in, but again, it's not letting me look at them that way. Let's see, oops. Is Phragmites a big issue in our would they die if they filtered 9 liters of Coca-Cola? I think they would. I don't think we're doing science on that just yet. Might not be a good idea. And is Phragmites a big issue in spotted gar ecology? I don't know for sure about that. I would think that with Phragmites, like they're more on the shoreline rather than in the water, I believe. So I don't know if they would be a big issue there. But again, with any sort of invasive species, they're likely outcompeting with those native species and contributing to the decline of the good native type of vegetation that we would like in and around the Great Lakes. But my next slide here is about invasive species. But tonight I will just be talking about animal invasive species, not the plant ones. But that isn't to say that we don't have plant invasive species and that they aren't causing problems. But these guys here are the ones we'll talk about. And an invasive species is some sort of living thing that's come from somewhere else, and now it's causing problems with our living things who've always been here. So we'll do a little snapshot and meet and greet of some of these. To start, we have a sea lamprey, and those are those 2 black snake-like things hanging on to our trout friend there. And they are latching on using this mouth that's about the size of a toonie, and it's filled with really sharp teeth. They latch onto our freshwater native fish, and they will suck the fish's blood until the fish either dies, or they might fall off a little early and leave the fish with a big open wound, which can often get infected, and the fish might die from that instead. As we can see in their name, they are a saltwater fish. They've come from the ocean through our man-made canals, and they are now here. It's hard to say whether they would have also made their way into our Great Lakes without those man-made canals. It might have just taken a little bit longer than it did with the help of our streamlined system. And once they got into our freshwater Great Lakes, they said, you know, this isn't my favorite, but it's all right. Look at all this food. I'll hang out for a bit. And they have, and they found lots of food while they're here. This is a good news story, though, because they are no longer as big of a threat here in the Great Lakes as they once were. And that has a lot to do with the federal government, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and other conservation groups helping manage these populations. And basically what we do is we go to where we know that the sea lamprey want to breed. Once they're all gathered and nice and ready to go, you scoop them up and you don't put them back. And of course, if we're just removing adults and not giving them that time to spawn, it's much easier to control these populations without worrying about the offspring. Usually the number 1 question I get in these presentations is, will this get me? And the easy answer is no. They prefer cold-blooded animals like our fish. Humans, of course, are warm-blooded, so we are not their preferred treat. However, if you are feeling extra strong these days and you have a lot of extra time on your hands, maybe you're thinking you might want to try swimming across Lake Ontario. That would take you about 40 hours of straight swimming. But you can do it. And during this time, though, your body temperature will drop enough to confuse the sea lamprey. And there are stories of these long distance swimmers who have to stop and yank the sea lamprey off of their wetsuit. Of course, they are wearing a wetsuit. It's not your bare skin. And of course, we have hands as well, which makes it much easier rather than these poor fish who can't get them off. Also, back last February, I had the opportunity to have a sea lamprey suck on my hand. And in my line of work, you have to say yes to that kind of opportunity. So the sea lamprey clung to my hand for about 10 seconds, and then it said yuck, and I said yuck, and it fell off, and I've lived to tell the tale. So, and you can see there's no permanent damage there. So I am not worried about swimming in the Great Lakes. I'm not letting these sea lamprey, even though there's not too many left, they're not bothering me. Next up, we have zebra mussels, and those are those smaller shells, mussels that are on top of the larger mussel on our left. And you can see that some of them do have those characteristic stripes, which is how they got their name. Zebra mussels came here in the 1980s on cargo ships from Russia. And basically with a cargo ship, you load the top with cargo, and then you fill this interior tank called a ballast tank with water to help balance out the cargo so it's not too top heavy. You bring your cargo to your destination, offload it, and then you also dump this ballast tank so that your boat is much lighter and can have a faster trip back. However, they didn't realize that a bunch of zebra mussels just got a free cruise from Russia, and they were dumped and then made their way into our Great Lakes. And they've been here ever since. And we do not yet have a good idea of how to manage them here. And unfortunately, as I said before, they are causing problems for our freshwater mussels, our native freshwater mussels, because they are out eating them and finding more and more habitat space so that there's nothing left for our native species. And they are happy to cover just about anything, right? We can see them covering this mussel, covering the motor of a boat. They'll cover our docks and our beaches. They don't really care. There is a little bit of good news though here that I will share, is that the zebra mussels haven't spread farther west than Lake Winnipeg in Manitoba. So over at the border of British Columbia and Alberta, as a way to stop the spread anymore, they've actually trained sniffer dogs to sniff for zebra mussels on boats that people are bringing in on their trailers. And they get these dogs to do all the sniffing, find the zebra mussels, and they are very good at it. And then they are able to properly disinfect and clean the boat before it comes into British Columbia. I also read an article I guess last month, and it was looking at some new research out of Michigan, where they applied copper to the water in select study sites, and they found that this copper in the water was able to bring down the populations of zebra mussels by like 90 to 95%. So there is some hope there. Still more research to come, of course. We're not ready just yet to start spreading copper everywhere in our Great Lakes, but there's some hope, and I have a feeling that in the next 10 years or so, we will figure things out and get these zebra mussels back under control. And then lastly, we'll talk about these Asian carps, and there are 4 kinds of carp that fit into this category. We've got silver carp on the left, black carp on the right, and then we also have big head carp and grass carp. And these carp all came here intentionally. Some of them were used in decorative ponds. People wanted to switch things up instead of koi or goldfish, so they thought they would bring some carp instead. And some were used for aquaculture as well. But they ended up escaping out of these isolated spots and made it into our Great Lakes. They are very disruptive in our habitat. Something like a black carp likes to eat aquatic insects that live and hide in the roots of our water plants. And when they start digging in the roots to find their food, they pull up these plants. And as we learned before, without plants, the water can become really mucky and dirty and cloudy, which is not good for many of our friends who need to hunt and see their prey. The good news is, though, is that there's no self-sustaining population of Asian carp in our Great Lakes. So again, we've got some really great conservation work from different groups where they are either scooping out the adults when they're ready to breed and go to try and get to these breeding spots, or they fully block the access to these breeding spots so that they can't reproduce and the adults are just stuck, not doing much except existing. Another kind of fun thing about Asian carp is that when they are scared, they will jump up out of the water. So if you're ever looking for a little pick-me-up video on YouTube, there's many that you can choose from to see these carp just jump like 2 or 3 meters sometimes out into the air. And just, I'm not sure what their technique is here, but they are just pretty funny to watch. So what can we do now about the Great Lakes? We learned about some of the wonderful species that we have here and some of the not so wonderful things going on, but let's look at what we can do as individuals. One thing we can do is to conserve water, so not waste water. These days we're washing our hands more than ever, and it's so important, right? We want to stay safe, stay healthy, but while we're lathering, we don't need to leave the water running, so we can do all that 30 seconds and then turn the tap back on. You know, it's a new year. Maybe you need a New Year's resolution to put on your list, and maybe that could be looking at taking a shorter shower. A good shower length is probably about 7 minutes long. So you can have a think about how long your own shower is and set some goals on trying to bring it down closer to 7 minutes and save water that way. We also don't want to litter. I'm sure as naturalists, you've seen what litter does in an environment, and I'm sure you often are the ones who are helping try and get this litter out of the environment. So of course, we want to make sure that if we're ever making garbage, we're putting it where it belongs. And we also want to be careful about what goes down our drains, because our sinks, our tubs, our toilets are all connected to the Great Lakes, and we don't want to put things there that don't belong. Things like expired medicine should go back to the pharmacy where they can be disposed of properly. We talked about road salts, right, and how we don't want to put too many out, and just try and be a little bit more careful about how close we're putting them to our storm drains. Another thing we can think about is glitter and other small pieces of plastic, because these little pieces of plastic are able to easily bypass our water treatment. And they are now in our Great Lakes and causing problems because some of our fish are starting to eat these small pieces of plastic. So just being careful about things like that. We know our 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle, but we've got 2 new layers on top now. We have rethink, which is about reflecting on the things we do every day and the products we use every day, and really take some time to think about if they are good for the environment. And if not, what can we do instead? We can also refuse, and that's just saying no to those things that are bad for the environment. Maybe next time we're getting fast food, they offer us a plastic straw. We say no, thank you, we don't need it. We see, though, all the way at the very bottom now, we have recycle. And that is because, unfortunately, some very new research is showing that every time we put something in the blue bin, only about 9% of it is actually being recycled. So that's about 90% of the things we put into our recycling, wishfully thinking it will be recycled, is actually going to landfill. And that is often because of contamination. Things like peanut butter jars or yogurt containers need to be fully clean and empty before we put them in the blue bin. Otherwise, they can cause contamination, so they just get thrown out at the sorting center. The good news is, though, is that our provincial government has said that in 2022, they will be launching a brand new blue bin program, which will hopefully get us all back on the same page, properly recycling and learning more about how to better recycle, because the education component has been lost over the years, right? I don't even know if only in the past few years I even learned about cleaning out my containers. So we do need to learn more, and hopefully more information will come in the next few months so that we can see what's down the line on our new system. I'm sure all of us here tonight are of age to vote, so we can vote for things that are in line with our values, but we can also vote with our dollar and be an informed consumer. Next time you're going to buy seafood, you can pull up the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch Guide or the Vancouver Aquarium's Ocean Wise Guide. And both of them are great resources that help you make more sustainable decisions when buying seafood. There's also some new research that is showing that every time we wash our clothes, little threads are falling off, going down the drain, bypassing the water treatment and getting into our Great Lakes, where fish and birds are eating them. This is a problem these days because most of our clothing is made with synthetic fibers. If you check your labels and you see things like acrylic or polyester, it's just code for plastic. So that means these little pieces of plastic are finding their ways off of our clothes into our Great Lakes. There is some hope though. There are things that we can do that will make a big difference. One thing is something called a guppy bag. That's G-U-P-P-Y bag. And basically it's like a garments bag, and you would put any of your clothes made with synthetic fibers in there. That's often things like our workout clothing, because polyester dries very quickly and doesn't smell too bad, which of course are things that we want when we're working out. But you put them in the bag, zip it up, and it's a very fine mesh. So the water in your washing machine still gets in there, but any little threads that fall off get trapped in this bag. Another thing we can do is to read the labels of the clothes before we buy next time, so that we can try to make some alternative choices if we can. And we can also try to buy less or buy secondhand and extend the life of those products that already exist, all while putting a little less pressure on these fashion industries to stop pumping out more and more clothes, because polyester is often much cheaper to make than cotton clothes. So that's why they are now trying to use more polyester, because they want to get more and more clothes on the shelves compared to things that might last a little bit longer with our natural fibers. Hopefully tonight I sparked some interest on our freshwater mussels, and I just like to let you know that the Toronto Zoo has a community science app that you can download that will help you identify freshwater mussels that you might come across. And this is an app that we built in partnership with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, our federal government. And basically, if you've got a mussel in front of you, whether it's alive or just the shell, you're able to see some pictures and learn about the different anatomy and features of these mussels, and do a little checklist to try and narrow down what you are looking at. Once you've got your final mussel, you're able to actually submit those findings, and it will send those to the Toronto Zoo as well as the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, where our scientists are then able to use this data to better inform conservation work. Because like I said, there isn't much research out there to begin with. So we are happy to take data from wherever we can get it, so that we know where to best apply for funding for different projects to protect the habitat of these freshwater mussels. And we wouldn't be able to do any of this work without all of our wonderful partners, whether they are other conservation groups, academic institutions, or the government. They are all doing really awesome work, as well as doing education for raising awareness on the different species that we have here in our Great Lakes. So all wonderful organizations to work with. And that is everything I've got for you tonight. We do have some social media pages, so if you're interested in learning some more about freshwater fish content that we have to share, you're welcome to give us a follow on any of these, as well as our Facebook page. And now I am happy to take some questions. At this point, if you don't want to write in the chat box and you'd rather just unmute yourself, I'm totally okay doing things that way. But
Okay.
yeah.
I'm going to jump in, Kat. This is Susan.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned at the beginning, you were talking about salmon, the Atlantic salmon program,
Mm-hmm.
that you released some of it at Duffins Creek, which
Mm-hmm.
I guess is over near Pickering.
Yep.
How concerned are you about the possible development around that area?
It is on our radar.
I don't know if everybody's aware of it or not, but
yeah. So in Duffins Creek, just a little bit south of where we generally release Atlantic salmon, they are looking to build some new developments there, and I think they're still in the approval process, so we're waiting to hear what's next. But we do work closely with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, who give us permits to do the releasing of the fish. So I guess they will be the ones who decide whether that's still a good location to keep releasing our baby fish, or if we might find somewhere new in the future.
Okay, I guess it's a tricky line for you because you can't get too political when you're funded. So I can imagine that's not
Yep, that's it, right?
Yeah, easy line to.
And it's great that you're aware of things that are happening, and if you speak
we don't
to
have
it,
any restrictions on
that helps
speaking
us
out.
all.
We will be speaking out. Thank you.
Kat, I see one question I got distracted by some other things. One question in the chat, I'm not sure whether you dealt with. Chris Evans was asking whether Phragmites is a big. Yeah, did you deal with that?
I think I got to that back when we were talking about the invasive species. So
Okay.
I think I answered that. I don't know for sure, just because Phragmites, they are mostly on land rather than immersed vegetation from what I understand. So I don't think they are causing problems too much in the water with the spotted gar, but they would be affecting the surrounding land around our wetlands and other bodies of water. So they are forcing out other native species of plants for sure, but I don't know if that's directly affecting our spotted gar. And then I see, does the zoo have any info on building a fish spawning pond on a lake? We don't. You might be, a better resource might be your local conservation authority, and they might be able to give you some more information there. On our zoo site, we do have a few rivers going through, so we do have fish that come through and spawn. And I guess one thing we're hoping to get working on in the next decade, I think, would be having some a space for us to have mussels on site, because the zoo, I think down in Kentucky, is actually raising freshwater mussels on site at the zoo and then taking them and I guess releasing them out to the wild, even though they aren't too active. So I think that might be a plan one day. For us, at least, I don't know, though, if I can give any more information or more information than you'd get from your conservation authority.
Again, as Kat said.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, I don't know, Kat, if you know, you mentioned about them stocking the lakes with Pacific salmon. Mm-hmm. Do you know what other types of fish they stock the lakes with?
So it's a couple different kinds of like trout and salmon there too. I don't know much more beyond that though, because there's, I think, at least a dozen kinds of fish that get stocked every year. And that's just based on interest from lobbying groups and what anglers would like to see. So it might vary a little year to year. I'm not too sure exactly about what gets stocked and when.
Okay, I guess they get input from the various, like you say, anglers organizations.
Yeah.
Okay.
The provincial government releases a sports fish book, though, or I guess it's not quite a book, a report every few years, I think. So they might have some more research or some more information there. I see Susan is asking if spotted gar is considered a sports fish. Because they are listed as endangered here in Ontario, it would be illegal to catch one. So it's catch and release only. I don't know if there's enough to really make a sport of it. I'm not too sure. But again, that sports fish report would probably be a good place to learn exactly what sort of sports fish are allowed and not allowed to be caught here in Ontario.
Just wait and see if there's any more. Again, there's also a button down at the bottom, reactions, where you can raise your hand if you want to get a question in, or just type it in the chat box. But I think the presentation was very informative. So you may have answered all the questions already.
Maybe I got them all. Well, like I said at the beginning, I have my email address there. So if you go back and watch the recording, or even just email Ken or Sue, both of them have my email. So if you've got questions after or want to reach out, you can reach me through that email.
I'm just wondering, I'm not sure how much work you actually do at the zoo, Kat, but if people, once people can go back to the zoo, is there a lot of information there about the native species, or an area there in the zoo that deals with all this?
Yep, so we do have some information about out our native freshwater fish in our Americas pavilion at the zoo. So that's our indoor area that has lots of different Native American species. So we do have some fish in there, including American eels as well as Atlantic salmon. The red-side dace is another one that we're hoping to get an exhibit on one day. They do swim in the rivers through our zoo, but we don't necessarily have an exhibit on them to raise more awareness. And I am seeing that Chris is saying that with the rising water levels in Georgian Bay, some habitats where the spotted gar are, and Phragmites is there as well. So I guess that on that note too, climate change is a big threat to our Great Lakes, mostly in Lake Superior at this point, and the warming water levels and the lack of ice that's being, the lack of ice cover now, and these extreme weather events, which are probably contributing to those rising water levels, can have an impact on the species that I've talked about tonight too, and increase the amount of invasive species that we have in our Great Lakes.
Well, Ken, I want to thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'm not sure, I'm not a fisherman, and maybe some other people out there, but you know, we spend our time looking at the skies and the trees, but there's some wonderful stuff under the water. And I think we should not only thank you, but thank the Toronto Zoo for making this program available. I know you worked very hard to bring this information out all across the province, but we really appreciate you bringing it to us here in Midland. With that, I'm going to turn the meeting back over to Sue, because we do want to deal with a few little club things before we close the meeting.
All right, well, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and good night.
Thank you, Kat. That was great.
Thanks.
Very informative. Yeah, it's always good to know, to be more aware. You know, we live near the Great Lakes, and it's just good to know more about what's actually out there and what we're seeing, and learn what should be there and what shouldn't be there is definitely important. Now, Ken, you mentioned a few things. Was there something else besides the tribute to Carolynn that we were going to let people know about?
Oh, not too much. I think you could remind people about the Jews situation, if you like. That's the only other thing I can think of.
About the which? Sorry?
The Jews, Club Jews situation.
Oh, the membership. Yes. Well, you're doing a good job of that. You've sent out, but yeah, just to let people know that membership dues are due, and Ken has sent out some emails explaining how those can be paid. And again, just so we can keep our bank balance somewhat healthy as we move into the next year. So before we let everybody—
Maybe just, Susan, just on that, because we have several people on the meeting that aren't club or current club members, if they're interested in the club and want to find out about membership, the best thing would be to go to our website, which is mpfn.xyz, and all the information about membership would be there.
Yes, and Chris has mentioned that the e-transfer worked well, and yes, it did. If anybody's using e-transfer, or even if you're not, it's certainly the easiest way to do it. You don't have to leave your home. So that's a nice option. Was there anything else, Ken, on that score?
No, I think that's good.
Okay. As most of you are probably aware, we lost Carolynn Fishleigh, I guess a couple of weeks ago now. She was a member of the club who certainly contributed enormously in terms of her time and her enthusiasm. And we just wanted to say a few words about her tonight. And if anybody else wants to mention anything, they're more than welcome to. I guess I met Carolynn again when she first came into the club, and I was just amazed at her, again, her passion for things. And if there was a cause that she believed in, she certainly was very passionate about it. And she cared a lot about the environment. She volunteered many hours to the club. She was a secretary, she was treasurer, and she would be at any event that was we were asked for public participation. And she made a wonderful Y-bean soup, really good. She put a little Dutch of curry in it, which I thought was really made it taste good. She also, again, she and Wayne, very generous people. I remember going on a birding trip with them, and they insisted on taking me out for lunch afterwards. They were giving me they were carpooling and paying for it and that. So they're very kind. They were very kind people, and certainly very generous that way. Kate is, I believe, Kate, are you on tonight? No, I don't know. Maybe Kate's not with us tonight. I thought she.
I'm here.
Oh, you are there. Okay. So I'm going to leave the Site 41 information to you to talk about. But I just wanted to also mention that Wayne and Carolyn were quite involved with an organization or a group that I was involved with called SHARE. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was the Simcoe Huronia Association for Renewable Energy. And I also had film nights as well that I did through that organization, and we would show environmental films once a month at the library. And Carolyn and Wayne were really big supporters. They came out regularly. They would be part of, we'd usually have a discussion group afterwards. And they were very interested again in that sort of new way of looking at energy. And they came on some of our energy tours. And we're even interested at one point in helping get a community renewable energy project up and running, but which didn't happen. But again, just very impressed with her energy and commitment, and we'll certainly miss her. I'll pass it over to Kate now.
Thanks, Susan. Well, just going back to when I first joined the club, Wayne and Carolyn were among the first people who made contact with me. In fact, I think at the very first meeting, they twisted my arm and forced me to stand for vice president. I had no idea that meant I was actually going to be president after that. But I'm very glad that they did. They were wonderful people. If Carolyn set her mind on making something work, it was going to happen. Because I remember when I first joined the club, there were serious consideration given to wrapping things up, and not enough people were involved and so on. We've come a long way since then, and Carolyn and Wayne are among the people who made that happen. I didn't get involved in Site 41, which for those who are new to the county was an epic battle to stop a dump site from being built on top of the Allison Aquifer, and in the south of Tiny and North Springwater, the artesian wells there, they have been tested not just by Bill Shodek, who's a University of Alberta professor, but who owns a farm there, but also by other scientists all over the world. And this is very unique water. It's exceptionally pure, purer than 4,000-year-old Arctic ice. And nobody knows quite why that is, because we have industrial agriculture here. The farmers spray, everything washes down, but there's something about the ecology that provides an amazing filtration system. So anyhow, that caught people's imagination, and Carolyn was among the early people who got involved in that fight, early 2004, 2005. And when I got involved in 2009, that was when the Anishinaabe got set up their protest camp, and I suddenly realized I need to be part of this too. They're coming down from Christian Island, and I live a couple of kilometers away, and I'm not actually fighting, and they're fighting. So I got out there too, and Carolyn was already one of the really knowledgeable and committed leaders of the effort. And everybody told us, absolutely no point, you're wasting your time. The decision was made years ago. The fix is in, it's a done deal, and on and on. Nevertheless, and it looked absolutely hopeless. I remember in August 2009, the county was putting on a massive push to get this dump site built. The trucks were coming in all the time. We were putting up pickets, we were getting arrested, and it was crazy. And yet, it actually all unraveled for the county in court, which is a whole other story. But by October, they had backed down, and they cancelled the project, and the people won. And I remember so many times during that summer of 2009 when Carolynn was there, motivating people, working really hard, going out with the teams that we sent out to the southern end of the county to tell people down there, this is what your mayor and your deputy mayor are voting for. Do you really want them to do that? And people were saying no, and phoning their mayor and deputy mayor, and the pressure was on. And Carolynn was part of that. And she was a very good friend. She was a very good person. And I certainly miss her. I phoned her on Christmas Eve. Something made me think I should get in touch with her. I'd been thinking of her for a little while, and I hadn't talked to her for a few months. And little did I know that a few days later, she would be gone. But she made her mark, and she was important to our club and important to a lot of people. And there's just one thing I think she would want me to tell you about, because she was such an activist. So right now that water is under threat again from expanded aggregate operations. There's a hearing that's going to be held, an LPAT hearing. The Federation of Tiny Township Shoreline Associations is leading the legal fight. The Ontario government has just granted a 10-year permit to take water to the main multinational that's involved there. And the fight is ramping up again. FOTSA is planning to appeal that permit to take water. You can find some of the information on the Aware Simcoe site. And FOTSA, Tiny Township, the Tiny Cottager, and their website, they have a lot of information, and I urge you to support their legal fund, because this is going to be a big battle, and Carolynn would want you to. Thank you.
Now, Ken, did you want to say a few words on behalf of Mary? You have to unmute yourself, Ken.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say before I share Mary's comments that I did spend some time tonight trying to get Wayne on the meeting, unfortunately unsuccessfully. Wayne regrets now having letting Carolynn be his IT master of the years. He's a little behind on all that stuff, but he says to me he can still talk on the phone. And so if anybody wants to call him, he should be in the book, or, email me, and I'll make sure you get his contact info, because he'd love to hear from everybody. And with that, I'm just going to share my screen and then share Mary Rajapaksa, who is another good friend of Carolynn's, is unable to join these meetings because she has limited internet access, but she wanted to share some photos and some memories of Carolynn. So let me just share my screen here. Okay, we start off. This is one of Carolynn was a lady of many talents and interests, and she late in life she took up painting. This was one of her beautiful paintings. She donated several of her paintings to various fundraising events for the club as well. And so I'm going to read some comments that Mary Rajapaksa sent in. I was so sad to learn about the. She and Wayne were the very first folks who virtually helped me to get my feet on the ground when I started to live here in Tiny back in 2001. The first time I met Wayne and Carolynn was at the Y Marsh. I think it was during the spring maple syrup event, when me as a freshly minted master gardener had to give a short presentation on shade gardening. I think it was around 2003 or 2004. Then they kindly invited me and my late husband to their home, and I saw a hand drum on the wall, and I only had to ask Wayne, can you play the drum? Boy, oh boy, did he ever play that drum with a big bang. And it was love at first sight and hearing from me. And they invited me to join them in the local hand drum circle, where I took to drumming like a duck to water. The rest is history. And this is a picture of Carolynn when she was secretary for the Penetang Garden Club, doing some planting down at the town dock of Penetang. They also introduced me to the MPFN, and again, the rest is history. I had the opportunity to join them in the Christmas bird count for many years, and they introduced me to the wonderful world of birds in a different way. She was the first person I called when I saw the bald eagle perched on my birch tree for the first time, December 2006, and sent her a photo, which I have now framed and hung in my eagle room at home. The bald eagle still visits me, flew over my home on Boxing Day this year too, when we had a brief sunny period in the afternoon. This is Carolynn at the Halliburton Wolf Center, and then Carolynn and Wayne at the same reserve. The four of us, Wayne, Carolynn, myself, and my late husband, Kingsley, we did a lot together, from being activists at Site 41 to weekend trips to Halliburton Forest and Nature Reserve Wolf Center, day trips to Beausoleil Island, even a plane ride with Wayne one fine summer morning. Carolynn was also the secretary of the Penetanguishene Horticultural Club, and we did a lot together during that time. Annual spring plant sale, planting day at the Penetang Dock, field trips to Awenda Park, etc. Here they are. This was a MPFN field trip to the Torrance Barrens, and you see Carolynn there with Wayne beside her, Sid Haddington, another member that longtime member we lost last year, and Ginny Wilson. Since we both lived along Champlain Road, I used to visit them often. They would visit me often too, when we had a beach. Mary's referring to the high water levels there. During the summer, we carpooled a lot on these family trips, MPFN field trips, etc. I will miss her and will think of her every time I pass her place on my way to town and back. May she rest in peace, Mary. There's Carolynn with Pat Taylor hugging a tree at Grants Woods, again on a club field trip. This was a club field trip to Awenda Park with Tim Tully lecturing the group. And there's Carolynn right in the center of things. And this is a picture from the protest at Site 41. There's Kate Harries on the left, and Chief John Teberge, I think his name was, of the Anishinaabe tribe, with Carolynn and Wayne fighting to save our water. And there's Carolynn and her friend Mary on the shores of Georgian Bay. So with that, I don't know if anybody else has any memories of Carolynn they want to share before we close the meeting.
May I speak? I'm Josie. I don't know if you can hear me.
Is that Josie?
I just wanted to say, I noticed you're recording this. And when at the beginning you said you were doing a tribute to Carolynn, I phoned Wayne and he was trying to get on because I think he needed to hear your voices. And we have been drumming on Zoom every week, which is crazy because we can't hear each other, but it's still wonderful. I'm wondering if there's some way of sending him this part of our meeting to him and letting him see.
Definitely, Josie. I told Wayne tonight as we were trying to get him on that we'll be sending him the link for the recording. And they're doing a lot of other tributes to Carolynn on the website and that too, and we'll make sure Wayne gets all those.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Josie. Anybody else want to make a contribution?
Can I make a comment, Ken? It's Dorothy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, and I'll just try to find you and spotlight you in a second. Just a second.
I think on my screen, I'm near the first. Beside Josie.
How do you spell McEwen again? That's a terrible
It's
name.
D. McEwen. I'm at D. McEwen right in the front.
Oh, I got you. Okay.
Okay.
There's
Yeah, I
Dorothy.
just wanted to say as a member of the book club, it impressed me on how brave she was when she was too ill to travel to go to the book club. She just hosted at her house instead. That terribly impressed me because she just didn't want to miss out on anything. And I'm sure the people, and I've only known Carol a few years because I haven't been in the Midland Club for very long, but that certainly made quite an impression on me that rather than miss out on things, she hosted herself. For
too ill to travel, but not too ill to host us all.
Yeah, that's right. And also I remember, and it saddens me, and I will treasure them forever, is knowing that she probably didn't have, her prognosis wasn't that great. She gave us a lot of her nature books. So I will treasure, and she signed them all for us. She wrote a little note in the books, Liz? That was very touching, that meeting. That's all I wanted to say. How brave, she impressed me with how brave she was and how generous.
Thanks, Dorothy. And anybody else? Don't be shy.
Well, then I will speak some more. It's Josie.
Josie, okay.
Because I met Carolynn. She sounds like she's been everywhere doing everything, because I met her at the Georgian Bay Cancer Support Center. I would say maybe 4 years ago, where they were running the drumming, meditational drumming. And as she's an amazing woman, as her health was declining, she would still come constantly. And this past year with COVID, we couldn't meet, but she asked if we would still keep coming to her house. So we were drumming in her backyard. And then at the end, when she could no longer be on the back deck with us or inside the door, we drummed it outside, and she was upstairs in the bedroom with the window cracked a bit, and she would tell us what to do if we weren't behaving. And we managed to keep that going right till a week before she left us. And so she made me promise we would keep drumming. So we've been trying to drum on Zoom now with the lockdowns, which has been hysterical, but we're doing it anyway. So we just had a drumming session with Wayne today. And when he heard about this, he wanted to get on right away. So yeah, please reach out to him. He really needs us around him. It's a very, very difficult time for him. It's hard enough for us. I miss her so much, and I appreciate it. I'm only in this group because of them. They told me about you. So there's another good thing they've done in my life. And I thank you for letting me be part of this group. And let's not forget Wayne. Let's get him in here.
Yeah, Josie, I can't believe as tributes were coming into Carolynn, the number of people in our club who said, well, I'm in this club because Carolynn got me in there, or when I did join the club, Carolynn was the first person that welcomed me and made me feel really at home. So many people, I really feel that Carolynn was, in a way, the heart and soul of our club. And she'll be certainly remembered and missed. And, she and Wayne were such a great team that we all hope we can reach out to Wayne, especially, well, when we can reach out to anybody and give him that great big hug I'm sure he needs at this time. Unless anybody else has anything else to say, I think I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Okay, well, thank you for everybody who spoke. And I spoke to Wayne yesterday, and it's definitely, yeah, it was good to have a word with him. So I would encourage people to, it doesn't have to be a long chat. I think we were on maybe 10 minutes, but just to let him know that we're thinking about him. And she was a very special lady, that's for sure. She touched a lot of people. Ken, did you want to mention next month's presentation while we're...
Oh, sure. We did a little bit before the meeting started, but next month, again, I don't have the date in front of me, but it'll be the third Thursday of the month, 7:30. And the Reverend Don Downer will be taking us on a photographic tour of Madagascar and parts of South Africa. And Don has done presentations for us before. He's an excellent photographer, an excellent presenter. So it should be a great show.
Great. Okay, well, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you next month virtually. And hopefully we can at some point start up our walks again too, because I know some of us are missing those. But in the meantime, everybody stay safe, and we'll say good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone, and good night.